All right, welcome everyone to this year's 2021 Plan II Symposium, where our distinguished Plan II graduates have an opportunity to share some of the research that they've been doing over the past year with us. I have to say, I should commend and congratulate the students for a year-long project of research under normal circumstances is challenging enough, is daunting enough, but you've also had a once in a century or so pandemic to deal with in the background. So well done overcoming all the obstacles and getting to this stage. My name is Cory Juhl. I'm a philosophy professor. And please, everyone, I'm sure most of you or all of you are familiar with Zoom etiquette, but if you would please remain muted. Nestor asked if we could just actually turn off our video as well. I'm not sure that's as necessary, but if you please remain muted. And if you have a question, all questions are welcome, if you think of something during a presentation or afterwards, please put it in the chat, and then I can read the questions to the presenters when the time comes. And I take it our situation when we're going to be sort of strict or fairly strict about time. So let's please keep the talks to about 8 minutes max, and then question answers again about 8 minutes max. All right, well, congratulations to all of you. So Alexander, would you like to go first?
Sure. Does my microphone quality sound fine here?
I hear you.
Okay, cool. Let me just go pull up my presentation. Okay. One sec. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. Not that long time ago, in a place not that far away, I was a computer science sophomore at a hackathon. At this point, I don't really remember whether I was slacking off or taking a break, but now it doesn't really matter. I was reading an article about philosophy when I came across the metaphor of the web of belief, and it got me thinking. In my studies, I learned about an area of math called graph theory. So graphs are these structures of little points with connections between each other, and they form the mathematical basis of many of computer science's most important algorithms. And then it hit me. Graphs look a lot like webs, so why not use them to create literal webs of belief? Why not let each point be an idea and each connection between points be some kind of relation between ideas? Discovering that other people have already had your big idea is kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, you're mad because they unknowingly stole your baby out of its crib, but on the other, it's evidence that you can reason properly and are not crazy. So long story short, my idea evolved from make a program that can visualize the essence of all thought to make a program for visualizing arguments that's similar to these 60 others, yet different enough to be considered in some ways an improvement. It's less impressive sounding, but it is actually possible. So I had to confront a few main questions. 1, what's the point of using computers to visualize arguments? 2, what can I learn from the existing argument visualization software? And 3, what do I want to build? So first, a quick review. By argument, I don't mean a hostile interaction with your spouse. Instead, I mean a set of premises that together logically entail a conclusion. While marital conflict isn't so fun to think about, thinking about arguments can be, because a good argument can move your mind towards unexpected truths. And behind the unexpected lies both humor and wonder. Arguments play a grand part in human life. In their most rigorous form, they are known as mathematical proofs and provide foundational knowledge upon which the sciences are built. In everyday life, we use their less strict form to guide our actions. For instance, I went to Chipotle yesterday, and I don't want to eat the same place 2 days in a row, so today I'll go somewhere else. So I think that at some point past Chipotle, on the Chipotle to math spectrum of arguments become sufficiently complicated and important enough to justify concerted effort to think clearly about them. And as it turns out, using computer visualizations to do so is quite helpful. So to figure out why, I searched the literature for cognitive science of visualizations. I found the answers pretty fascinating. So I found that visualizations function like an extension of your short-term memory. If you write down what you're trying to think about, when one of the ideas slips your mind, you can just glance at what you've written and find it again. Also, visualizations can be used to convey abstract concepts with concrete perceptual information. Since perception is a much quicker process than abstract verbal thought, a good visualization can convey the same idea with greater speed and subjective ease. And also, we can use different kinds of thinking. So take verbal versus spatial reasoning. It stands to reason that using more kinds of thinking to tackle a problem makes the solution come easier. Since visualizations add spatial reasoning to the mix, they can enhance thought in this way. At least in my case, this agrees with my personal experience. I often find that I don't really understand things until I can draw them out. But as for why we should use computers to draw our visualizations, there are a few reasons, but there's one most important one. When you mess up on paper, you have to erase, and that sort of messes up things around it. When you mess up on the computer, the software can allow you to just drag the offender away, retype the words, and so on. And so you only have to make necessary changes because it can keep track of how each part of the diagram relates to each other. So as I alluded to earlier, most existing argument visualization software is converged on some version of a graph. So another quick review. What do I mean by graph? So I don't mean a bar graph, as is on the left. I mean the kind on the right. So it's a kind of mathematical structure that has a set of points and a set of connections between those points. Argument graphs usually have a point represent a claim, while each connection represents how the connected claims form some kind of argument. Usually these graphs are directed, meaning that the connections have a direction and should not be interpreted as going both ways. This is often represented by drawing the connection as an arrow. So points in different argumentation systems don't often mean the same thing. Some systems have different kinds of points, such as reason, objection, data, etc. But the evidence I encountered suggests that having too many kinds tends to just confuse the user, so I decided to just have one. A proposition, meaning a sentence that is either true or false. Instead of explicitly having a data point, you can just have the proposition saying the data is X. So what bothered me most, though, about such systems is that they were merely visual. Computers really shine when they are made to do complicated logic and math, so it seemed like a missed opportunity. A system that performs maybe a calculator-like logic function, in addition to visualization, seems pretty useful. And the systems that did do something like this didn't do exactly what I had in mind. And here I have an example of just a common argument graph. So I decided to give it my own spin. I've been pretty fascinated with logic, and I learned more about it through my computer science curriculum. And since propositions are the building block of logic, I decided to give my graph just a pretty precise logical interpretation that you could then hook up to pre-existing logic solver programs and maybe ask questions of the logical consistency, such as, are these claims compatible, or how many different combinations of claims make this true? So I ended up with the following. Ultimately, I'm not going to go through the whole thing right now, but the basic idea is that you have a conclusion or an argument connection, and you have basically when all the premises are true, the conclusion is true. I have the logical symbol or sentence for representing that. And I have a conflict node, which is like, or edge, which is like mutual exclusivity, meaning that they can't all be true at the same time. So I think I'd just like to show like what the program I actually have does. So I'm gonna have to switch over real quick. All right, so do y'all see? I think you do. So Well, this is just an example argument graph I made in my program here. You can move around the program like this, but as you can see, this is like the most classic example argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And so you represent these are the premises by the arrows coming from it. This is a single connection. This is just how I represent it, and it goes to this. This is an example of the mutual exclusivity node, because we have, for example, all gods are immortal. Socrates is a god. Well, that can't be true at the same time that Socrates is mortal. And then here's another reason why we think Socrates is mortal, because it seems that he ate hemlock and died. And we might believe that because the trial of Socrates might be historically accurate. So this is just an example. There's some functionality I can show of it actually working. Here's one thing I'll show right now. So let's say you get a pretty big graph. You can toggle different nodes, meaning that you don't look at the things that precede them because maybe right now you don't actually care. So you do that button, it represents that it's toggled by having the dashes here. You can untoggle it by doing this. So this is, the program's still in beta right now, still developing it. So you can edit stuff like that. If I wanted to delete this, there's the delete button there. And you can add stuff by, for instance, doing this. I just have double click, make a thing. So you select the things you want to do something with. These buttons are temporary. The blue one means you can make an argument, you connect it. Let's say you wanted to make a conflict here. There you go. So that's the gist of it. I haven't integrated it with sort of the logical functionalities and like solving that I talked about because I'm still developing it, but this is the gist of what I have right now. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Alexander. Please, you can applaud virtually. If anybody has a question, please post it in the chat. It's actually a small enough group. If there's a follow-up or something, we'll see if somebody might want to give a verbal question, unmute themselves briefly. So let me start things off. Oh yeah, so Jordan asks, why did you choose to use React?
Just because I already knew it. Like I've made stuff in it before, and I mean I find it pretty easy to use. It is a very popular development tool.
So Aiden asks, how would one use your program, for educational or other reasons?
So yeah, you could use it for educational purposes. There's actually a decent deal of empirical evidence I encountered suggesting that like people have used it for that, and they found that it does seem to enhance students' acquisition of critical thinking skills through a variety of experiments. They've tested this. I think the evidence could use some more time to accumulate, but it was generally positive, and it makes sense. But I think you can use it in a more than educational context. Like I've used argument diagrams to help me personally think about things that I'm reading. If the arguments get complicated enough, I find that like just the process of having to like explicitly parse it helps you understand it. And I think looking at it also helps too.
All right, Spencer Edwards asks a very tough one. How will or can this be used to resolve political conflicts when the people don't speak the same language?
So are we talking about like they literally don't speak like someone speaks Spanish and another person speaks English, for example?
Spencer, if you want to clarify, if you want to briefly, yes. Okay, so you're talking about actually people with different languages. Can you still use your system to grab arguments?
I feel like that goes beyond the scope of it. you'd have to have like, I guess, a translator working with people, like maybe two people from a different language could collaboratively use this, and there's a third translator who's making sure they understand what's being said. I guess that could be a solution.
All right. Do arguments follow the same logic across cultures?
Depends on what you mean. Like in the sense that I'm using logic, I'm gonna have to say yes. It's abstract sort of mathematical treatment of logic. But if you're using a more colloquial version of that word, then like different people might find different phrasing of arguments convincing in different cultures.
All right. Aiden asks, what interested you in this topic?
Yeah. So was that all the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So sort of what I was getting at the beginning, like I've just been interested in philosophy for a few years, and also I'm in computer science, so I'm interested in that too. And I just sort of encountered that metaphor of the web of belief, and I was like, maybe we could use some program to help us think about philosophical arguments. And so that was my main motivation. I wanted to like combine my computer science skills, my interest in philosophy, and see if something interesting could come out of it. And I have at least like personally used it while reading like dense philosophy books, and I find it helpful.
All right. Any other questions? Let's see, like maybe one more. What surprised you most during the project?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So something I ran into is I noticed how much of language in prose doesn't exactly fit like argument structures. Like for example, I think like examples, my example is of examples. I think examples don't exactly fit as premises. It's more like you're trying to just paint a picture of like a scenario in which something is true. It's not exactly a premise. Also, like personal anecdotes and maybe like wordplay don't. But that's not something you'd want to remove from prose, I think. So there's certain parts of prose that I think prose still does better. But I think argument maps are still like a nice tool that you can use to help yourself interpret these better.
All right, let's thank Alexander again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And all right, let's move on to Jordan Hilder, whose project was Hijacked Brains in Digital Modernity.
Okay, thank you, sir. 1 second. Let me just get everything situated. Okay, can everyone see this clearly? Okay, I assume so. I'm Jordan Hilder, and this is my project, Hijacked Brains in Digital Modernity. Let me just make that a little smaller. And okay, let me start you guys off at the beginning of the journey. Okay, so essentially, where did this all begin? This began all the way back during the first month of Zoom classes. And essentially, as you can see, I was trying really hard to focus on classes, but it just wasn't working. I was kind of playing games in the background. I know there's a canvas, like the professor's like trying to show something there, but it just wasn't sticking with me. And I realized I had to turn on my face camera to keep myself accountable. And that kind of led to some other problems, because when I had my face camera on, I was constantly observing my hair, just constantly making sure I wasn't looking messy or dirty. And it gave me a lot of anxiety. This kind of led into a problem with a lot of students. We felt constantly watched. It was like we were almost in a prison. And this drove me to start using apps like Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, Twitter during class. And I'd just be infinitely scrolling through these apps, just pretending to pay attention, but just like using that to kind of take the edge off. And it made me think, am I an addict? I was like spending copious amounts, like way much more before I spent during, I guess, before the pandemic. And this kind of leads into the idea of surveillance capitalism. And essentially, that's the idea that right now we're in an era where all of our data is being mined. Like the user is the product. Like every single data point that can be collected on us, such as like when we wake up, like when we go out to eat, when we exit the door, that can be just mined and turned into data by like various systems and data analysis. And right now, there's just not enough laws around digital privacy, nor any fiscal reason for these corporations to change. So going back to the Zoom story, I was trapped in between like two panopticons, Zoom and social media. And for those of you who don't know what panopticons are, oh my God, I am sorry. That was the wrong swipe. But essentially a panopticon is a prison tower that has blacked out panes, and a ton of cells are built around it. And essentially it allows the foreman in the panopticon to keep an eye on everyone, but he really can't see everyone at the same time. But since the panels, as you can see, are grayed out, he can kind of like, the idea is that everyone feels like they're being watched. All of the prisoners are going to conform to conformist, like they're just going to like start conforming just because they feel like they're being watched, like the power structure is being internalized. The more knowledge the authority has on them, the more likely they're going to start just conforming, and the less deviant behaviors are going to happen. And we can kind of see this in social media, where like we have authorities that can constantly watch us through social media, but have kind of evolved past that point into a post-panoptic society where it's not just the authority that is watching us, but it's also a variety of just everyone using the app. Right here in Facebook, all the users are looking at each other, and this kind of like leads to where the authority isn't always in control. Like it's a more fluid system where like cultural hegemonies just aren't always in play. It can just be, there's a lot of transference between users. So the panopticon isn't, as Michel Foucault, the philosopher who kind of came up with the idea that this power structure would be negatively used by governments. It's now everyone kind of has a say in it, and everyone can slowly influence it. And the goal of lots of these companies is to kind of utilize panoptic power to kind of make users conform and change user behavior, and to kind of make them act certain more profitable ways. And you know, I really thought about this, and I was like, could I do what these big companies are doing with like an app, just like with no previous experience? Could I just develop this out of something? Because like data is the new gold in this world. Like our data is just so valuable. And that led me to Scry, the all-seeing eye. So essentially, this app is a distraction blocker. And I figured if I can make a panopticon via an app, I could kind of keep myself in focus. And it would start off as a panoptic app, but I could evolve it into a post-panoptic app where like different users could like keep track of each other to make sure that we're focused on productivity. The idea kind of came from another app called Forest that essentially utilizes a timer to make sure you're studying. But for my app, it would just like, it would, the thing with the timer is if you cancel the timer for Forest, the tree will die. But my incentive was to like use push notifications and notifications to keep users paranoid. So as you can see, I just developed this app. This is just, we're using Firebase right now to keep track of everything. Well, all the Firebase is basically a backend that just allows us to keep control of like all the data, because I did not want to manage the data myself. And essentially right here, we're scheduling a push notification. Essentially, like you say, oh, I have a Plan II Symposium at like, I guess 10 o'clock at night. So then it's going to send you like a little reminder that like this will happen. And I had to time this perfectly so the reminder would hit exactly at 10:51. Essentially, we're asking Apple to send you a reminder. So basically, it will bring you back to the app. And that leads us to the next tech demo. Excuse me. Okay, there we go. This is the login screen again. I'm just showing how a new user is made. We don't really have email authentication. So as you can see, I'm using a fake email. Hopefully no one has that email in Gmail. But right here, this is the focus component. So you can set the amount of time you want to focus. Like for a class, I'd set 50 minutes, but this is just going to like time you. And I'm just shaking the phone around right now, just simulating like me picking up my phone, getting distracted during class and looking at things. So essentially it just sends a little reminder like, hey, get back to work. And like every time that happens, like every time you pick up your phone, we record this and we can use this data to kind of like model your behaviors. Like we can start sending you notifications when we think you're about to touch your phone, like maybe like 30 minutes into class, you start getting really bored. So we'll just send like maybe a little reminder. And we have a leaderboard function we're implementing. This is still in the beta, but also I don't know the exact ethics of this, but essentially a leaderboard would compare all the users of the app and it would show who the best student is. And this could be very harmful. I'm just saying I do get a lot of anxiety being compared to other people. So quite frankly, I don't know if I'm actually going to implement that. But let's just go to, and this brings us to takeaways and final steps. So essentially, like, I got to a good place with this app. I feel like I did kind of build a panoptic system. I haven't a post-panoptic system implemented, but I feel like when I've used it and beta tested it on me and my friends, it kind of works pretty well. Like, it gets us to do our work, and we kind of do feel a little uncomfortable being watched. But like the next step would to be make it like post-panoptic. And just also one big takeaway took away from this is that like big companies, we need to put pressure on them to maintain best practices. All my data collecting is done through Google, and like I can literally see when you guys schedule your appointments. I could see the name of it. So like if my friend Hassan like signed up for this, I can maybe see that he was attending the My Little Pony convention like in 2 hours. So you just got to be really careful with this tech. And that is time for me. I do want to give a special thanks to Dr. Balco and Dr. Greg. My mom just totally helped me like read and do a lot of research, and Leon and Hassan for like helping me with a lot of the tech aspects. It definitely was hard coming in as a newbie, and that app you saw definitely took a lot of time to build, but thank you guys. And now I'm ready for the Q&A.
All right, thanks, Jordan. Very interesting. Please add your questions as usual. So Hassan asks, how would you turn this app into a full-blown company?
Oh, I was just waiting for that one. I love that one. So essentially, we've kind of theorized that the future of like apps is like vertical social media companies, and essentially like vertical, like meaning that like these companies, like these, they're just going to be, sorry, I'm getting very excited with this one, but essentially that like Facebook is generalized, but something like I guess Tinder is a good example. It's like vertical because everyone's on there for a certain function, like dating, or like even Facebook Marketplace, like everyone's on there for a certain function, like I guess selling things. So I'd maybe make this like a study one. Like if I were to like, if I had actual money, I'd probably buy LeetCode or like try, I know Pramped is bought, but essentially LeetCode is a big computer science practice thing. And I try and integrate these features. Like the next step in the app is like maybe a two-way portal where two people can like look at each other while studying, but they have to challenge each other not to say anything at all. And I think that would just be very interesting. Like I'm not bringing this to Y Combinator anytime soon, but I have thought about this in the past.
All right, Benjamin asks, is there a danger that a system designed to manage anxiety itself unintentionally generates anxiety? And if so, how might you control for this?
So this is a very good question, because originally I wanted my app, before I was playing around with the exact ethics of it, I kind of did want it to assuage my anxiety, but I feel like certain things that you may use to cope can be very harmful to other people. So like, for example, like if I set a reminder on my phone telling me, hey, just make sure to do this every day. For me, it could work really well, but I know some other people who just, like my brother, they cannot stand the pressure. Like if you tell them to do something twice, it will just like, they'll procrastinate it 3 times more. And to control anxiety, honestly, I have to bring in some more users, and I'd have to test on more users, like utilize more psychologists, definitely like hire people with more of an expertise, since I am a computer science major. And I think everyone deals with anxiety differently. Mm-hmm.
Will you ever add a feature that will lock you out of your phone for a set period of time instead of using the honor system?
So that was, the funny thing is with the competitor app Forest, they actually implemented that. I was planning on doing a lockout, but for their lockout, you got to pay premium. I guess I could, but then I know there's always like emergency phone calls like you can utilize on an iPhone, but I just feel like locking a user out would be like beyond my jurisdiction. Like eventually I'm going to make all this code public on like GitHub. So if anyone else wants to do it, be my guest. But I just feel like that's an ethical question I can't quite consider yet. And it would take like a lot of time to really like parse and do the research to figure out if that would even be like a good solution. Mhm.
What are some of the technical challenges you faced when building your app?
Oh man. There were a lot. Honestly, I may look trendy now, but I'm terrible at design and fashion. So like when I first designed my app, Professor Bulko can like attest to this, but I think I went through like 4 different designs and all of them looked like they were scrapped together on like PowerPoint, like Paint or Microsoft Paint. They looked god awful. And I think just like getting a good design down that was succinct. Also, I do not have an iPhone. Like I haven't had an iPhone in years. So I came into this class with like really outdated design language. Like originally, like that clock you saw that uses like the iOS 14 date picker, that was not a clock. Users were just typing in numbers and it was really gross. And also like just formatting everything on the screen so it would work on different phones. Like not only like it should work on like an iPad and an iPhone, and just trying to get that working was a little bit hard.
All right, let's have one more. Darong asks, how did your work experience shape your development experience?
Ooh, that's a very good one. This summer or last summer, I worked with Athena Health, and my mentor, Juliana, she was really on the ball. She just kind of showed me like, don't take things too hard. Don't take things too seriously. And it was kind of scary for me because everything I did was like, I didn't do an intern project. Everything was being pushed to like one of their main programs. And if you signed up for the COVID vaccine with UT, that was also my code that helped you sign up, just because I was working with dates and scheduling. And just like all the like me, I'm checking your email. No, I'm not checking your email, but my code's just making sure you typed in your email right and just making sure like you're being reminded for your appointments. But I think that work experience with Athena was just beyond helpful. And just also just seeing like, I guess there was a lot of last minute work at Athena, and I'm a last minute person, but not feeling guilt for like doing things last minute felt really good. I mean, just like delivering the best quality code possible is what we should strive for. And you know, if you need to take like a few days to research it, you shouldn't feel bad for being behind. So like for like I did some self-study, but like thanks to Professor Bulko, I really caught up to like where the language was at and like what to do. Mm-hmm.
All right, excellent. Let's thank Jordan again.
Thank you guys.
All right,
And
so
good luck, everyone.
next we have Darong Key, Reaching for Artificial Consciousness, Computational Models of the Brain.
Thank you, Dr. Juhl. Here. Oh. Can everyone see the presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Hi, so for my thesis, I wanted to capture the essence of modern theories of consciousness and ask a simple question. Based on these theories, are we or are we not able to model consciousness with modern technology? And I know this is a very broad topic, so for here, I would like to paraphrase a quote from one of my favorite neurophilosophers, Dr. Patricia Churchland, that the possibilities in this field are legion, and the particular subjects I discussed today are merely ones that are most relevant to and appeal to my imagination. So where do we start? We might want to start by simply asking the question, what is consciousness? While there are many definitions, the Oxford Dictionary defines it as the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings, which is great. In short, it's a higher function of the mind that allows it to process what we like to call subjective experiences. However, are we able to capture the contents of consciousness within the physical model? Now, this is where things get interesting. In philosophy, there's a problem called the mind-body problem. Essentially, there's a debate on whether or not the mind exists separately from the body. We have dualism and age-old theory that the mind exists in a supernatural state because it has introspective capabilities beyond the reaches of physics. On the other hand, we have physicalism and materialism, modern theories that the brain itself is capable of generating all that we know about consciousness. And this is our first conceptual fork in the road, because both dualism and physicalism have modern supporters and detractors. Metaphysically, dualism might not be wrong. There is an argument that every experience can be subjective simply on the grounds that one person's perception may not be exactly replicated by another, and that there are many other cognitive functions such as understanding and processing a language which aren't yet fully ascribed to physical states. These leave much to be desired of physicalism and open up an avenue of discussion for dualism. However, for our assumptions today, we're going to go with a physicalist and materialist point of view, which make the case that eventually all facets of mental processes may be deciphered from a neuroscientific perspective. As I quote Dr. Bernard J. Bars, the founder of one of the theories of consciousness, which is called global workspace theory. One time-honored strategy in science is to sidestep philosophical issues for a time by focusing on empirically decidable ones, in the hope that eventually new scientific insights may cast some light on the perennial philosophical concerns. And we'll revisit what's left to be discovered a little later on in this presentation. So what are some of the modeling frameworks associated with consciousness? There are essentially two approaches that you can take from here. You could either adopt a neurobiological one or a mathematical one. So a neurobiological one seeks to approach consciousness from like a first principles biological standpoint. We want to encapsulate every behavior of the brain in terms of neuronal representations. And while I won't go too deep into the biology, there's a term associated with this. It's called the neural correlates of consciousness. So what modern neuroscience seeks to understand relative to the question of consciousness are these physiological correlates: representation, integration, attention, memory, and so forth. And there are many interesting and thought-provoking issues associated with this. For example, you might want to consider one of the simplest figments of human attention, which is the Necker cube, as shown on this slide. So there's 12 simple lines on that cube, but it can be perceived in two different depth formats depending on the interpretation of your conscious visual system. There are many important factors that go into understanding which one the visual system may take: pupil dilation, line dimensions, the fact that your visual system decides to switch between one and the other rather than take one side and just go with it, and so on. But these lines show that grappling with even the smallest components of attention and consciousness might not be a simple task. And this is the reason why consciousness as a subject can be such a gargantuan issue when it comes to integrating bottom-up sciences such as neurobiology with the top-down theories of neurophilosophy. While creating theories that emerge from biological understanding is a solid approach on paper, there's too many points of focus and too many future research papers yet to be published that stand between, now and having a stable biological theory for the basis of consciousness, which leads into our discussion of the second modeling paradigm that you can adopt when it comes to consciousness, which is mathematics. And essentially, you can choose to sidestep the specific biological structures and abstract them into mathematical concepts like information integration. I know the field of artificial intelligence is very unpopular right now, but there is a distinction to be made between that and what we can consider a model of human intelligence, because artificial intelligence has also gravitated towards different paradigms that may or may not be similar to the original human inspiration. But this is not to say that there aren't mathematical models out there that do model human consciousness. So one of the most famous theories related to consciousness is the global workspace theory, which postulates, in short, that the brain is like a distributed system of specialized processors that work on separate conscious tasks like attention, decision-making, and action selection. And then these share and exchange information with one another in a global workspace. When it comes to attention, more important tasks become highlighted. And these special processors have been adapted into quantitative models, such as neural networks. And one of the most famous models of global workspace theory is the, I don't want to butcher this, but Dion-Changeau model, which uses neural nets to model these individual processors in the global workspace theory. And another example of the quantitative theory is information integration theory, which is, but while this one doesn't have a specific model yet, it serves to provide an explanation for whether something is conscious or not using the value phi. And essentially what it does is it uses a bunch of axioms and in order to describe whatever the information that you might be looking at, such as a picture or a video, as well as the processes going on within the conscious subject, which in this case usually is like a lobe of the brain, but could technically be anything. But between the subject that is supposed to be conscious and the inputs, it creates this value phi that describes whether or not it's conscious. So let's say if we had a table as our conscious subject, it would not be processing anything, therefore the phi value would be 0. So when it comes down to actually creating representations of consciousness, is it possible? Philosophically, there are many problems with subjective experiences that whether or not we don't know whether or not individual cognition has a unique quality to it that can't be transferred. Neuroscience biologically says probably, but it might be a few hundred years before we know everything and are able to model everything. We do have projects related to the simulation of the brain, which is what I listed out here, like the Human Brain Project and the Blue Brain Project. And there are individual elements of it that are pertinent to consciousness, like wave scales, which model human brain waves under sleep. However, there's still much to be learned about the physiological side of things. And then finally, mathematically, there is everything that we see has been modeled out, but mathematics needs to wait on neuroscience and biology in order to still understand whether or not we have captured everything pertinent to consciousness. Yeah, so that's my presentation.
All right, thanks, Darong.
Other questions?
Good job. Let's thank Darong. All right, so Alexander Davis asks, what do you think about panpsychism?
Panpsychism. That's pretty interesting. I haven't actually looked too much into it yet, but that will probably make it into the final bit of my thesis.
All right. So I'll ask one. Sometimes it's thought that consciousness is so hard to explain by brain activity is because what we study in science tends to be third person accessible. We can observe it like anyone in the lab can observe the same thing, whereas our experiences seem only first person accessible or private. Like your bright neon green experience is yours alone, and no one by scanning your brain is going to, as it were, see the same thing, or even if they did, it would be their own experience. Do you have any thoughts about that sort of bridging the third person versus first person gap?
Yeah, so that was sort of what I mentioned with the issue of subjectivity. I think until sorry, maybe I should reshare my presentation. But until we equalize subjective experiences, until we find a way to sort of quantify that and maybe replicate it, until there's a metric for that, it's pretty difficult to describe exactly how, you know, my vision of, like, let's say like a red apple is going to be the same as your vision of a red apple. You know, there's that question of like, is my red the same as your red, or is my, you know, is what I'm hearing the same as what you're hearing? You won't know until we find a way to quantify that.
All right, so Aiden asks, what interested you in this topic?
Yeah, so I'm a neuroscience major, and back in the summer of my sophomore year, I did some research in a lab, in a psychology and neuroscience lab. So what they did was a lot of work with perception, but it was like very much like, you know, in the weeds, like first principles, like basic science, basic science work. And what I really wanted to investigate was, the bigger picture. I was always wondering, like, so when does this expand out into the bigger picture of actually, instead of modeling, small bits of attention, how are we going to be able to model attention in general, or, the bigger, or consciousness? So that's how I came to think about this topic.
All right, Jordan asks, what were some of the weirder applications that this research could be applied to?
So right now, the issue is that I think going from bottom up, there is still too much to be determined. And from a top-down perspective, there are some debates and some issues that can't be resolved until the bottom-up side, which is, the basic sciences, expands itself or does some more research. So as of right now, I don't think particular research with concrete theories are able to be created, which is why the conclusion is a little bit more nebulous. So yeah, I'm afraid I think right now there might not be applications for this research, simply because I don't think it's concrete enough at this stage.
Well, all right, let's thank Darong again. Great project.
Thank you.
And let's go to Aiden Snasdell, who is speaking on her project, Political Rhetoric in Social Media, How Donald Trump's Tweets Changed the 2016 Presidential Election.
Okay, hi guys, let me share my screen with you. Okay. Hi, I'm Aiden, and I am a Plan II in journalism student. And as he said, this is Political Rhetoric and Social Media, How Donald Trump's Tweets Changed the 2016 Election. So my interest in this topic began 4 years ago after the 2016 election, where I noticed Trump communicated on social media unlike any other political figure. So for this thesis, I wanted to answer the question, what unique approach to Twitter did Donald Trump take in 2016? And to answer this question, I looked at what he tweeted and when he was tweeting. As my research unfolded, I began to hypothesize that Trump's unique Twitter use came down to two main ideas, this idea of false familiarity and agenda setting. False familiarity is a false sense of participation, security, homogeneity, and consensus that under conditions of social media, where users are both producers and consumers, the circulations of posts have the power to sway or move opinions. And agenda setting is the idea that issues in the news translate to what the public and the news consumers are thinking about, and eventually what issues become important politically. So in other words, how news coverage can set the agenda for what becomes important politically. So my thesis kind of looks into how Trump took authority of this agenda setting by using Twitter as his medium. So how I did this was I looked at what he tweeted by creating a database with all of Trump's tweets from May 5th, when he won the primary in Indiana and became the Republican presumptive nominee, to November 8th, the day that he won the election. After reading his tweets, I noticed specific themes and words that created trends that led me to the false familiarity theory. I decided to take the totality of the words and create a word cloud to demonstrate the most frequently used themes of his tweets. And then I categorized them into groups that demonstrated the false familiarity theory. To look into when he was tweeting, I used the database that I created and I separated them into individual days. Then I organized them by a 4-hour cycle. So beginning with midnight to 4 a.m. and so on, to see during what time periods Trump was most active on Twitter. And I analyzed these results. So here is the word cloud that I was talking about. These are 100 of Trump's most frequently used words, and the larger the word is, the more frequently Trump was tweeting about it. So he created this sense of false familiarity with his base through constructing himself as the outsider and to appealing to the general public in a unique way. As the outsider, Trump created a distinction between himself and Hillary, the media and other Republicans, and the system itself. He tweeted so often about Hillary Clinton that 7 different words on that word cloud alone are references to Clinton in some way. And some of his most liked and retweeted tweets were about her. And his attacks on the media are clear and direct. On May 15th, 2016, he tweeted, "The media is really on a witch hunt against me. False reporting and plenty of it, but we will prevail." He says this so clearly to say that the traditional media sources cannot be trusted, but he also creates like this sense of camaraderie by the use of we, as if to say the media is against him and his supporters. And of course, he is the person that can save them, which I thought was really interesting. To appeal to the general public, he used informal, simplistic tweets, and also retweeted them directly. You can see to the bottom left of the word cloud, the RT represents how many times he was retweeting anyone. So, and often this was just like general people, and that made him feel close to like his supporters, and kind of say that Twitter is a medium where anyone can speak to Trump and has the potential to be acknowledged and responded to by him. So by creating the sense of false familiarity, he's able to relate more closely to the people he's tweeting to his base, than the traditional systems and practices that would put him in office. So to begin my discussion about how Trump used agenda setting in his tweets, I think that this tweet really exemplifies the bridge between false familiarity and agenda setting. On September 9th of 2016, he tweeted, "For those few people knocking me for tweeting at 3 o'clock in the morning, at least you will know I will be there, awake, to answer the call." I mean, I couldn't write a better example of this myself. He highlights a closeness to his followers by saying that he will be there for them at any time of the day. But he also acknowledges that many of his tweets come from an absurd hour in the morning, and he's proud of it. As I said, I organized all of his tweets by day and then cycled by time period. And what I found was 25.7% of the time, Trump was tweeting between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. So most often, Trump was tweeting during that time period. So to contextualize this from a reporter standpoint, as I said, I was a journalism student. Let's say I wake up at 7 or 8 a.m. for my work day, and I need a new story to write about. And I look through my social media, and Trump has tweeted 68 times at 3 a.m. about some policy or bashing one political opponent. That could give me some great ideas about what my story of the day will be about. But that's just me. So how does that apply to real news coverage? A moment that demonstrates this example perfectly is this interaction between Trump and Joe Scarborough, who is one of the hosts of the popular morning TV show, Morning Joe. And on May 9th of 2016, Trump was tweeting that he was never going to watch Morning Joe and that he misrepresented his opinions. And minutes later on live TV, Joe Scarborough responded to his tweet saying, "How you doing, Donald? That's very funny when you say you don't watch the show. I think it's cute. Keep it up." And so this interaction not only shows that Trump is keeping a close watch over the news coverage that is about him, but that the reporters that are creating these news are aware of this fact, acknowledge this fact, and oftentimes devote attention in their TV programs to Donald Trump's tweets. But not only did Joe Scarborough talk about Trump's tweets, but other independent news sources, such as The Wrap and Yahoo News, also wrote stories covering Trump and Joe Scarborough's interaction. So what Donald Trump wanted to talk about, that his ideas are being misrepresented in the media, was disseminated to all audiences of the news that covered it. So not just Morning Joe's audience was aware of Trump's tweet. Also, all of the other news sources that covered it talked about what Donald Trump wanted to be in the news of the day. In conclusion, I hope that I explained why my preliminary research demonstrates Trump's unique Twitter use of constructing false familiarity between him and his base, as well as how he served to set the news agenda, which potentially contributed to what voters cared about. Now, is this the reason Trump won the election? I can't say. I am not sure to what extent these theories translate to actual election results. But what we do know is that Trump's approach to Twitter was unprecedented and can and should be considered by future campaigns, no matter their political party and their approach on social media. So thank you so much for you guys' time today. I'm ready to open it up to a discussion or answer any questions you guys have of me.
All right, thanks, Aiden. Let's thank Aiden for this presentation. So we already have some questions. Let's see. With your agenda setting research, did anything else stick out to you as interesting?
Yes, that's a great question. So the agenda setting research was kind of a doozy to take on, just because he was tweeting so much during this time period, and organizing it was a really big task to take. But what was interesting when I finally got like the data about, okay, how many tweets per cycle was Trump tweeting, there were really specific days that he tweeted way more than the average amount of times per cycle. So usually it was like 2 or 3 tweets per 4-hour time period, but these outliers were like 30 times that. Like sometimes there was a time where he tweeted like 68 times during one cycle. What was interesting about that is where those outliers were, there were 7 days where he really tweeted a bunch during one cycle, and 6 out of 7 times where these outliers were occurred during the first cycle. So during midnight to 4 a.m. So he wasn't just more frequently tweeting during midnight and 4 a.m. When he had huge Twitter spurts, it also occurred during that time period. So I thought that was something I really interested me during kind of my agenda setting research. Thanks.
What is your opinion on his Twitter ban?
That is a good question too. So that was an unexpected thing for me, because I started this thesis last year, even before that. I think it was like a semester before, when we kind of started constructing these ideas. So no one knew that he would be eventually banned from Twitter. And I think it's probably good that he's banned from Twitter, because what my research shows. But I basically had to find different websites that had his like tweets archived, and then extract like data from there, and because all of his tweets weren't around anymore.
All right. What was the most challenging part of your research?
So I think that I think that him being banned from Twitter was a challenge. Honestly, narrowing down kind of my topics of this thesis, I think, was hard, because there's just so much you can talk about when it comes to Donald Trump's Twitter. There's so many different directions you can go, and what was challenging was kind of deciding, okay, what direction am I going to go in? What do I think is the most important thing to talk about regarding this topic? And then also, as I was kind of saying a few minutes before, just the mass amount of tweets and the time it took to organize and categorize all of his tweets.
So John Baker says this would make a very interesting article for the general public audience. What do you think about that?
Well, I agree. It would be really interesting. I mean, that's like why I loved talking about this and writing about this. I think for some reason Donald Trump's social media presence was so intensely fascinating to me that I decided I had to write my thesis about it. And I mean, shout out my amazing thesis advisor, Joe Cutbirth. He really helped me kind of narrow this down and get to where it is today. But I hope maybe one day it'll be published. I'm not sure. We'll see.
Outside of the Twitter ban, have you seen any change in his tweeting pattern over time?
So I really only studied from May 5th to November 8th. So I really know mostly about that time period, but I mean, prior to this, I was looking at through his tweets. You know, not really, because he tweets literally all day. If you look at like the breakdown of the like frequency of when he was tweeting, the second highest times he was tweeting was from 8 p.m. to midnight, and then from midnight to 4 a.m. So he's essentially tweeting all night. And I think that Twitter, like the way that like Trump's relationship with Twitter was, he has always had this idea that he can control the narrative of whatever he wanted people to hear. So if in my first slide, I didn't read it out loud, but from a tweet in 2012, he said, "I love Twitter. It's like owning your own newspaper without the losses." And that was in 2012. He recognized the power and the outreach and the way that like tweets kind of could like affect people in 2012. And he also realized that like Twitter would be a way for him to have authority over that. I'm reading the chat. So do I believe that Trump supporters said that he was banned to stop shooting himself in the foot? Do I agree? Yes and no. I mean, I think that his tweets were so incredibly varied, right? Like there were tweets where he was like extremely mean, like bashing his opponents. He bashed the GOP, but then he's also like tweeting about like Mexican tortilla bowls. Like, do you guys remember those tweets? Like he shooting himself in the foot. I mean, sure, but he, from being banned on Twitter, he still has that outreach, and I think it frustrated him more than he felt like relieved.
Do you think this study could help other politicians?
Definitely. That's kind of the last point of what I was talking about, but I didn't get into it super deep. But I think that this study was meant to help other politicians. I'm someone who is currently like working in the political strategy field, and Trump's tweets and approach to social media is something that can be studied no matter what party they're in, because he had this unique effect of creating such a closeness with his base through Twitter. So of course it could help other politicians. I think other politicians should study how he did that and apply that to their own ideas and relating to people in their own way. Because I mean, to kind of piggyback off of that, I mean, social media is constantly evolving. So if you can study not like, okay, this is how we post a Instagram post, but if you can study how did this politician relate to people in a really unique way, then you can use that for no matter how evolved the social media posts or social media platforms exist, right?
Well, thanks to everyone for all the great questions and for coming to watch all these interesting talks. And let's thank one more time our speakers for a great job, for wonderful projects for the year. Feel free to unmute if you want to. All right, well, I think that's it. Great job, everybody. I enjoyed the talks very much. Sure, the rest of us did as well. Congratulations on being just about finished, and good luck in your future research.